Let me start just by asking you guys a question. If I don't know if this is in your reading this week or not, but what do you know about the minuscule writing style? Did you read anything that told you why this shift happened or what they think the reasons were? Yeah.
It's faster.
Faster.
Write faster.
Okay. Anybody else?
Takes up less space.
Takes up less space. Yeah, Metzger and Ehrman both, and I believe in their footnote, talk about the fact that it was a quicker style of writing and that it took up less space. And both of those are true. Okay, those are part of the answer as to why. Okay, it's a much bigger question, but that's part of it. Let me give you a quick introduction of why this is important, or why it was at least important for me. And it's important as you move forward and working with manuscripts. So according to the Lista at the INTF, which is in Munster, you guys have looked at that already, more than 2,900 manuscripts of the estimated 5,300 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament are written in the Greek minuscule hand. So what this means is, if you're going to do any research in New Testament manuscripts, unless you're going to isolate yourself just to papyri, you're going to have to learn to read and look at minuscule manuscripts. You all have a text-critical apparatus assignment in this class. It's going to come up in a couple weeks, I think in about a month, if I looked at the syllabus correctly. That's going to require you to be able to read a minuscule manuscript to check it against a majuscule one. So knowing how to do this and knowing what it is going to be important even for this class. Now, the importance of this shift from majuscule script to minuscule shouldn't ever really be understated. You know, it might go by the wayside with people thinking, okay, this just happened, but it is an important event in history. Klaus Wachtel in Munster wrote that with the minuscules we encounter a remarkable phenomenon. The invention of this new form of writing fundamentally altered the circumstances under which all literature was transmitted. So keep in mind, this isn't just the Bible, the way they wrote the Bible changed. This is the type of writing in Greek culture that changed everything they wrote. By the 12th century, you no longer see majuscule handwriting in anything outside of titles. So this took over the way they write it. It was a new form of transmitting information. Now, with this, New Testament scholars had kind of left it alone. They just took it as the change in time, moving on. We're not going to talk about it much anymore. Now, paleographers, the guys who study, and women, who study the way we write or the way writing is done, have spent the last 100 years or more looking into this. And they've been writing on it. Now, unfortunately, most of them didn't write it in English, so it requires a little bit of digging to actually learn about it. But they have been looking at it. Now, Metzger, everyone knows Metzger, in his book with Dr. Ehrman, he wrote this about the minuscule hand. He said, some of the most beautiful specimens of Greek handwriting are certain classical and biblical manuscripts dating from the 3rd to the 6th centuries. In the course of time, however, the style of the book hand began to deteriorate, and the letters became thick and clumsy. Then, about the beginning of the 9th century, a reform in handwriting was initiated, and a script of smaller letters in a running hand was created for the production of books. Now, this is true up to a point. What's not true about it is that when he says a reform in handwriting was initiated in the 9th century, that's completely wrong. Okay? And that's one of the really big reasons why we did this paper, is because New Testament students and researchers and scholars haven't done enough looking into this history to give the accurate information. Okay? And it sounds like it's kind of a bold thing to say that Metzger was wrong at this point, especially for me to say that, but this is the way, just as simply the case of history. Now, there are other New Testament scholars that have been a little bit more specific with this. Klaus Wachtel was one of them, but mostly it just gets ignored. The earliest dated Greek minuscule manuscript we have comes from the 9th century. That's where he's getting that time from. All right? But that is not the very first time it showed up. All right? And we'll talk about that when we get to this. So let's start with just the first question. What is minuscule script? Okay, I've already heard a few comments. It's lowercase handwriting, right? Or it's the smaller letters. You see, it's kind of odd because we talk about it like majuscule is capital and minuscule is lowercase. But that's anachronistic. We're thinking that because we have majuscule and we have minuscule. When majuscule, all the capital letters, when that existed, that was just it. There was no other kind of writing. And when minuscule takes over, there's no other kind of writing. So the question, we talk about it, it's just the best way we can talk about it, but that's actually not how you have to describe it. As Peter said, you know, before, and Dr. Metzger said, oh, we went too fast. Back in those times, between the 3rd and the 6th century, they wrote in this majuscule text. Now, I have heard a few people say it in this class, they've called it Unseal, but I think Dr. Gregori already made this clear, that Unseal, according to paleographers, is exclusively reserved for Latin. So if anybody catches you saying Unseal in Greek, they will be mad at you. It's Majuscule. Majuscule is for Greek, Unseal is for Latin. So Majuscule and Minuscule. And so you can see that this is P72, excuse me, P72, and this is a kind of a sloppy Majuscule script from the 3rd, 4th century. This is how it was written prior to the 9th century. This thing skips fast. All right. So how do we refer to it if we're not going to talk about it as a capital letter? Well, the way paleographers refer to it is a bilinear script. Majuscule is a bilinear script. If you think about when you used to learn your letters, you had the top line and you had the base line, and your letters had to match. It had to start on the base line, they had to reach the top line. That was always how you did your capital letters. Okay, the same rules apply. A majuscule was a bilinear script. It went from top to bottom, and it always filled that line. When minuscule came along, they changed the rules and they adopted a quadrilinear script. So what you have is 4 lines instead of 2 lines, and the minuscule actually goes through all 4. You either attach from the baseline to the top line and you go through the middle line. Some letters only go to the midline. Other letters go below the baseline to the line under that. So what happened was they changed from just 2 lines to 4 lines, and this adopted this smaller type of script. Now I know that's exciting and riveting and everybody can't wait to hear what else happens, but this is how we talk about this kind of handwriting. All right? So it went from bilinear to quadrilinear. So it went from something like this, your very nice biblical codices, right? This is a literary bookhand majuscule. What I mean by that is, you saw how kind of sloppy the other one was, that papyrus was, right? This is a bookhand. It's different than simply writing. When you write in a bookhand style, your hand is supposed to be supported, and you're very careful with how you write the letters. And each time you lift the pen up, re-ink it if you need to, come back down, but the hand stays steady. And so they get this kind of exacting letter style. As you get further on and people start writing in what's called a cursive majuscule, they just start letting it flow. And things get a lot sloppier and harder to read. If you ever read my cursive handwriting, you would know what that looks like, because it's horrible. My cursive handwriting is horrendous. It ends up being just like this. So if you look at that, that is a roughly 11th century minuscule, very nice minuscule, bookhand, very similar to the kind of text that you just saw in the last presentation last week in class. So over the period of time, it transitions from that to that. Now, a lot of Greek students have a hard time with minuscule because it doesn't look anything like you've ever read before in most cases. Even your printed Greek New Testament, your Nestle Aland, does not look like this. So, yes?
When did lowercase Greek letters become part of the...
And that's actually where we're going to go all the way back to the as far as we can find it. And we'll talk about it in just a minute. It's a good question. It's actually part of the question of the entire thesis. So this changed, and it changes in such a way that you can't recognize the letters. Now, in your handouts, this is why I supplied so many handouts, for 2 reasons. One, you're going to need these if you're going to read a minuscule script. This is like your key to unlocking how to read Greek minuscule. All right, so they will help you when you have a manuscript to look at. But also because I want you to be able to see the shift in the way the letters work. I'm waiting for it to jump like 3. There we go. All right. So you have in your handout, you have a similar one to this one. It looks like it's all in German, so I apologize for that. But Greek scripts in the Middle Ages. It looks like this. Okay, this is a similar handout on the screen. And what it's showing you is how things changed. And it says Unseal, Germans. But it should be majuscule. It changes from the Unseal and majuscule letters to the cursive majuscule, and then to the minuscule. Now, as you look at that, I'm just going to give you kind of a quick description of how some of these change. Okay? Let me get to my page here, because I'm all out of whack now. There we go. All right. So if you look at those letters, I'm going to walk you through some of these characters. The alpha is written with a single stroke of the pen and is then closed into an oval. Now, if you remember looking at Vaticanus, last time, you'll actually see that their alphas start to look like this early on. All right? The alpha changes into an enclosed oval, joining the following letter with a tail. So this is where that kind of cursive flare starts to come in. The beta loses the familiar handles or the loops that you normally see of the Minuscule days, and it becomes an underhand cursive that joins to the following letter. This is probably one of the most confusing letters in the entire thing because it looks just like the P or pi, depending on who you learn from, or the mu or the nu. Okay? That throws a lot of people off when they're reading. It adopts an underhand cursive that joins the following letter. The gamma assumes a particular form due to its rapid shape. If you look at the way the gamma looks like in the majuscule form, you've got that crossbar, but notice that the crossbar begins before the downstroke. Now imagine, you're used to doing that carefully, now it starts speeding up your stroke. That gamma, that crossbar starts to curve as they go around. And then what happens is that gamma starts to go below the line. And then it's a really fast motion and just becomes a flip. All right, that's how you see this evolve as they go through what they're doing. The delta develops an apex and extends into an arc, so it gets that overhand loop that it has, ties it to the following letter. Epsilon joins the lower portion into a circle, and the open end stays open. The eta passes from its capital form to what looks like a Latin B at the time, but it looks almost like an H in English script, like a lowercase h. The eta does, and it can be very easily confused with a kappa, which is actually why you'll see later on that the kappa reverts from being a minuscule to being what we call a semi-majuscule, which is kind of a small capital K, because it's hard to see when it's next to an eta. The lambda goes into a high elongated loop and descends below the baseline, and the pi, I'll say pi because I know every time I say p, people look at me weird. The pi closes its two vertical rods into an oval shape, so it almost becomes like an omega, or even a beta if you're not being careful. The sigma closes the lower form like the epsilon did, when the top bar just goes straight across, so it can connect to another letter. And then the phi, I think phi is appropriate, starts to look like a treble clef. You can see that on the forms. And then, of course, the omicron, which is something that the omega, which is something that we discussed with Dr. Anderson, goes from being open, like a W, to being completely closed, like an infinity symbol. So these are the way the shapes change. Now, like I said, you can see how a lot of them look very similar, and unless you know how to read this without a guide like this, it becomes almost impossible to read. So if you look at this, let's go back one or two. Here we go. And I'm going to step out of the shot for just a second. But if you go back to this, you see this beta, the decorative one. You guys can see that over there, right? That's the old style, right? Everybody knows that's a beta. Now look at the one next to it. That's the word biblos. It looks like a mu. So I'll come over here so you can see this as well. Beta, yada, beta. Okay? So you see how some of these things, they'll use even different symbols in the same text. And that's actually a really nice one. Some of the later ones are horrible. So this is how the change happened, or this is what happened. You went from that to this minuscule. And so I guess I could have just gone to that slide. So when did this happen? That's really the question. We talk about it. When did it originate? What caused it to happen? Well, there's a lot of causes. Okay, some of them are economic. We're not going to talk about every cause because that'll take too long. There was a lot of economic depression in the Byzantine Empire at this point. They're stretched very thin. There was battles on literally every border. The Arab nations were starting to advance and take over different populations. There was an embargo from Egypt on papyrus. So they were not able to get papyrus. They were moving on to vellum. They needed to save money. Okay, so some of these things all factor into manuscript production. As we talked about, they needed to save space. But the bigger thing that was going on, in my opinion, and I'm not alone, is the theological controversies that were going on. So I'm going to ask you guys to raise your hand, and don't be embarrassed because I didn't know what this was until I had to look into it. How many of you until today, until I'm going to say this word right now, have ever heard of the Great Oconoclasm? Okay, a couple people. It's 3 more people than me. You heard?
Bruce Shelley's book years ago.
Okay, yeah, so the Great Oconoclasm is one of those things that I was like, I don't know what that is. But this was going on between the 8th and the 9th century. Now, what was going on was the emperor, decided that icons, the images you see in the museums these days of Mary and Jesus and all that were put in the churches and were used for worship at home, were now illegal and they were heretical. He had changed his position, and the emperor was the leader of the church at the same time. So he and many others decided this was not going to be used anymore. Many monks, particularly one monastery in Constantinople, opposed him, and for their opposition, they wrote a lot against him. A lot was written against them. They were also removed from Constantinople. They were banished. The abbot of the monastery, who we'll talk about a little bit, he was banished at least 5 times until an emperor in the 9th century repealed that and said the icons can stay, and they have stayed since then. So this, we don't think about this much because in Protestant circles we don't really do much with icons, but for them this was life-changing. For the church, this was how they related to God, especially in their homes, because most of them weren't able to read a Bible all the time. They used images. So when someone said you can't have images in your church, in your monastery, in your home, it was like they were saying you can no longer have that relationship with the Lord. So it was a big, big deal for them, and people died for it. So it was one of the biggest controversies in the history of the church. That is going on all around this whole shift in handwriting. It might not seem like it's related, but in a way it is, because they needed to write a lot of work, and they didn't have a lot of time to write it. When we talked about minuscule is faster. Cursive majuscule is fast too, but it's not quite fast enough. So I'm going to introduce you to a man named Porphyrus Ispensky. Porphyrus Ispensky is kind of the Russian Constantine von Tischendorf in a lot of ways. He was they call him an archimandrite in the Greek Orthodox Church, in the Russian Orthodox Church. And he was essentially a patriarch. Now, he was also a lover of manuscripts. Porphyrus Ispensky is also the man who went to Mount Sinai and to St. Catherine's Monastery and found Codex Sinaiticus. So he and Tischendorf are the ones that had both parts. To this day, Russia still has the other half. So England has one side. Tischendorf gave it to the British Museum. Well, yeah. Yeah, and then they gave it to the British Museum. Yeah, and then Uspensky brought the other one back to Leningrad, is where it's at now. So that's who this man is. Now he was very fond of learning about, Hebrew culture and Jewish culture and all these things. And one of the areas under his rule, when he was named Porphyrus, that's a title, not a name, was a monastery in Jerusalem. It's called Mar Saba. Now he went there and he found a manuscript that didn't look like most of the other manuscripts he'd seen before. Now it wasn't the first time he'd seen this kind of writing, but this was not like that writing. So what he found was what we now call the Uspensky Gospels, named after him. He found a minuscule gospel codex written entirely in minuscule with the exception of the notes in the margin and a colophon at the end of it. Now, what made this a big deal was not that it was minuscule, because like I said, there was already minuscule manuscripts in existence, obviously. They were all dated to the 11th century, though, and that's when everybody thought it started. This one actually had a date in it, and this is almost impossible. You don't rarely ever find this in a manuscript where there's a scribe named and he gives you the date. And this was dated to 835 AD. So it now pushed back the date of this handwriting 200 years, right? So he collected this, and he brought it back to Russia to have it studied. So he kind of brought it to the world. Now, it sat there for quite a while before it really got any good attention done to it. But it was studied over in about I think in the 60s, it really started getting some more focus, and they got into looking at this manuscript. And what they had found, this is the Uspensky Gospels, Gospel of Matthew. You can see that first word is the same first word as what you saw in the really fancy decorative one. But notice that the B looks like the underhanded loop B. It's not the fancy decorative B, beta. And that's because we're dealing with an older text. They didn't do decorative letterings at this point. So this is what he found. And they started looking at it. Now here was the kicker. Not only is this older by quite a few centuries than what they'd found before, but it's actually pretty well done. I mean, those lines are straight. Those letters are even. It's readable if you know how to read it. It's done quite well, which means this is not the first time this has been written either. So it has to be older than this. And that's where the mystery kind of began. How old is this? Now, again, this is where manuscripts intersect with other studies, okay? We're talking about church history at the same time. This is where the Colophon gives us, oh, don't tell me that's gone. There we go. So, this is where the Colophon gives us what we need to know. There are two, and you actually have a copy of this in your handout. If you find it in the back, I translated it for you so you could be able to read it. Let's see if we can find that page. If you find it, oh. Yep, that's the one right there. Yeah, sorry, it looks like this. Okay, so you've got an image on your paper, and you've got the Greek and then the English translation. All right, so there are two colophons. The first one is on the page prior, or the folio prior to this, and it actually describes three different monks that we happen to have other history on. It describes a man named Plato, not the Plato, another Plato, a man named Joseph of Thessalonica, and a man named Theodore the Pseudite. Every one of these men had a history written about them in the Greek church. So we knew who they were, we still do, and we can trace what their life was. They're all related even, okay? Plato is the uncle of Theodore, and Joseph is the brother of Plato. Now what makes this interesting is that Theodore is the abbot of the Studium Monastery, okay, which is the monastery in Constantinople that withstood the emperor during the Iconoclasm. Theodore is the one that was excommunicated 5 times, and Theodore is the one who wrote almost everything against the emperor. Plato is his uncle who convinced him to be the abbot. Plato is said to have taught him how to write, and both Plato, Joseph, and Theodore are known to have been trained in classical literature. They're known to have been trained how to read, how to write, and how to learn the sciences. And they were all placed in charge of monasteries. This comes into play a lot later on, but now we're starting to get a historical picture that fills in some of what we don't know about this manuscript. This is what's exciting to me about working with manuscripts. You start to touch something that's literally a piece of Christian history, right? So now you get to this colophon. Now this is what it says. I'm just going to read it to you. You have it in front of you. By the grace of God, the book written by God was completed by the priest himself on the 7th day in the month of May. In Diction 13. We'll explain that in a second. Year of the world, 6,343. Now I am convinced by all of those making intercession in remembrance of me to do this writing, Nicholas, the sinful monk, may it be I might find mercy in the day of the judgment, O Lord, amen. It's kind of a standard colophon. You know, he's asking the Lord to be merciful to him as he's done this labor of love. And people were praying for him to do it, you know, for his strength. Because we talked about this, I think, or Dr. Gurry talked about it. It's a hard work, copying a whole manuscript, oftentimes done in a single sitting. So try writing an entire, 4 books of the Bible in a single sitting by hand. See how you feel at the end of it. So what do we have in this manuscript? What do we learn about it? Well, we learn who the scribe is. He's Nicholas the monk. Well, what do we know about Nicholas? Nicholas also has a history written down. Nicholas was the man who was exiled with Theodore. He was his understudy, and he eventually becomes the abbot of the same monastery. In exile, these men traveled together until Theodore died. Now, Theodore dies after icons are let back in the church, but chooses not to return. Nicholas does return, but he doesn't return right away. And this is where we start asking questions. Okay, so when did he write this? Well, it tells us the date of the year of the world, 6,343. Now, this is where I'm thankful other people have done the work for me. The Byzantines measured time on the basis of what they thought the beginning of the world's creation was. That was the year 5509 BC. So if they give you the date 6343, you have to subtract 5509 from that to give you the date of our calendar. Now you'll notice the date comes to about 834, and I've been saying 835. Well, that's because the Byzantine year extends over an 834, 835 timeline, and this is the month of May. August 31st is the end of the year for them. So it's closer to 835 than 834. That's why we do that. Now, the indiction thing. Now, I won't get this too complicated because you're probably never going to have to deal with this ever again. But it's here, so we should look at it. This is how they measured years. It's based on a 15-year tax cycle. Now, every 15 years, they'd be taxed. That's how they measured time. So you'll find the way to mark time based on what indiction they're talking about. And thankfully, a man named Victor Emil Gardhausen, a wonderful German man, actually cataloged every single one of them. And you have a page in your handouts that translates it into the year you're in. This is only one page. There's literally like 20 of these. This man did a lot of work for the rest of the world. And if you look under the section called Theophilus, you will find the year 835, and it has next to it the letters. It's kind of hard to read. It's a little blurry. It looks like a sigma. It's actually what we call a stigma. And stigma, and then I believe it's tau, mu, and gamma. And if you look over in the manuscript, you'll actually see that on the fourth line to the right of the border. You'll see there's 2 overlap strikes on it as well. That's how they identified numbers. So you match that, thankfully, to Gardhausen's, and he tells you what year it is, and he matches the indiction, which is the 13th indiction, which is exactly what our manuscript says it is. So we found that's how you find a date. Unfortunately, it doesn't say this was in 1995 or something like that. You have to do the work to figure out what in the world they're talking about. But that's how we find the date. That's where we get the date for the Uspensky Gospels. And again, that's why most people, if you read New Testament scholarship, they're just going to say that in the 9th century, things changed. Well, it's because in the 9th century, we found a dated manuscript, but that's not when things changed. That's simply the earliest date we have on a manuscript. There are other manuscripts that just don't have dates, and that's where we come back to paleography. So we looked at that Colophon. Oh, and interesting, just another side note. I only found this out a couple days ago because I did the work to look into it. I was talking to Dr. Gary about this. We don't want to limit ourselves to just New Testament in this kind of a question because other works were written in Minuscule, right? The earliest dated non-biblical manuscript is from 881, so it's 50 years or so after this. It was written by a scribe named Stephanus the Clerk. We don't know anything about him other than that's his name, but we do know that he wrote it for a man named Arethusa of Caesarea. And this was in the 9th century. Dr. Gary might know who Arethusa is. Arethusa of Caesarea is known for his commentary on the book of Revelation. He was a Christian man. This man, Stephanus the Clerk, wrote this in Constantinople, the same place this person studied. Now the question was, did this get written in Constantinople? The irony is, it did, as far as we can tell. But what is interesting, somehow it got from where it was written to Palestine, and we don't think it was written in Palestine either. What we do know is that Nicholas probably wrote this somewhere in between his travels with Theodore, after Theodore died, before he went back to the monastery. He goes back to the monastery in 848. The only thing we know is that he stopped in a place called Firmopolis in, I think it's Turkey, and we believe that's where he wrote this. Then he took it with him back to the monastery. How did it end up in Palestine? I think this is even more interesting to me. The monastery in Palestine used to be run by a man named John of Damascus. John of Damascus, of course, he was from, we're talking 6th century now, right? 6th, 7th century. John of Damascus gave Theodore the Pseudite all of his theological insight on how to defend icons. So Theodore used all of John of Damascus' work for his own defense, and Theodore took the Marsaba monastery and brought it under the Studium monastery in Constantinople as part of their larger family while he was abbot. So when Nicholas comes back, he becomes abbot. It's not at all strange to see a manuscript written by him travel to another monastery that's within their control. And they're all still linked by this gigantic controversy of icons that caused so much of their problems. It's just fascinating to see how some of these things are maybe not they're kind of inconsequential, but they're just, I don't know, to me they're riveting to see how all of this kind of works together like a spider web. So this is where we get to our earliest date. But then we have the question of where, you can't do papyrus without papyrus font, right? Of course. The question is, where did it come from? We already said that wasn't the first time they wrote it. It's far too precise. Someone took the time to learn how to write this like a bookhand. So how did it start? And this is where we go back to papyrus. So now we're moving back even farther. Now, to get to the 9th century minuscule bookhand, you have to go all the way back to basically the end of the papyri days. So Metzger was right. The magical script starts to decline. People start moving into cursive script. It gets really sloppy. This is when you were looking at good papyrus. Everything was nice and upright. You could kind of read that if you knew what you're looking at. And these are, mind you, not biblical texts that I'm showing you. These are going to be like receipts and contract deeds. So don't worry about trying to figure out what you're looking at. Okay. This is nice. Eventually, it starts looking like that. And it gets worse. Now you'll notice in the bottom there's even looks like a different person writing. So you've got two different hands. Good luck with that. But now notice something though. Look at that's an epsilon in the first line on the left, actually second line technically, in the left corner. And below it, that's an epsilon and a key, right? That looks a lot like a minuscule epsilon. Okay? Things are starting to change as they move into cursive. And so what we see, beginning at least with the 6th century, and I didn't bring any or put any pictures of this, but at least as far back as the 5th century, you will see changes of what becomes the minuscule in majuscule papyri. So yeah. See, that's not animation, that's something else. There we go. Okay, so here you have one that's from the 7th century, all right? And it's pretty nice. It's pretty clean. Everything's nice and upright. But look at some of these letter forms. Look at your alphas. Look at your epsilons. Look at your rho. You notice how things are changing. Look at your gamma. It's not complete yet. It's a thing in evolution. It's a thing in process. People are starting to write faster. The script is starting to change with the needs of the time. Then you get to the 7th century. Let's hope this does this without flipping through it again. There. 7th century. It's a little bit more cleaner, right? But now you're seeing a lot more. Okay, you have a lot more. You have a sigma tau. Weird connection there. You have deltas are starting to look a whole lot different. Here's your phi is looking really weird. Now what about this? Now you actually have this in your handout. You see that? It looks like an ace of spades, right? On the top, second line to the right. Anybody want to dig through your handout and tell me what that is? I think we got a few minutes. No. I'll give you a hint. It's not just one letter. This is a famous symbol. It's found at least into the 5th century, actually. It's one of the first ones we see. Illuminati. Early form.
The first is an epsilon.
Yep. If you look at this page, go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 lines, okay? Or even, it shows you that symbol, all right? And if you look at this page, the one that you had handed out, if you look really, really closely, because the print's really fine, you have the same thing down here, but it actually tells you the letters above it in really small print. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, actually. It's an epsilon and a rho combined. So this starts the epsilon. It hooks down. You see, it starts here. You go up. You do the rho. You come down. You come back up and do your epsilon backwards. So it's an ER, if you will. And you see that. These are the things that pop up in minuscule. So you see these, you're like, ooh, that's cool. Or that's really frustrating. I hate this. Why did they do this? But that's one of those signs that we see of early change. And then you start using ligatures, my favorite word, in minuscule. Now, this changes, of course, again. This is 7th century. And then you get to the late 7th century, and you have this very famous, for paleographers, piece of manuscript. This is PSI 12-1266. What this is it's just an order for ship caulkers to not hide because we need you, it's wartime, if you hide, I'll kill you. That's basically what that says. And it's written by 2 different people, but if you look at it, it's almost entirely in minuscule. Okay, it's not fancy minuscule, it's not necessarily nice, but it is actually quite clean. Look at how common all the descending strokes are. We start to see that in minuscule. Now, when we go back to Uspensky, you're going to see they tighten that up. It gets smaller. They're not these big flourishes, right? But you've got all of your kind of minuscule forms. You've got rows. You've got your tau looks smaller now. Your eta is up there. It looks really it looks just like they've described the mu has dropped down. Everything has changed by this point. So in non-book writing, minuscule was there. It's already there. 7th century, 8th century, they're doing it. Now, I didn't give you a slide for this, but we know that this changed early on, and we know why, because we have examples of school class instructions changing majuscule to minuscule. And you can see the students having to do the work. Now, that happens in the 6th century. Give it 100 years, very few people start to know how to write majuscule anymore. So what happens when those people become monks, or they become clerks, or they start working for the government? An entire shift in the way people have written begins to take over in every avenue of life. And this is where the minuscule comes in. But someone still had to make it into a nice bookhand. For nothing else, because we don't write the New Testament in sloppy. That's the rule. Everybody knows you don't write the New Testament sloppy if you're going to show it to people. So what changed? Well, we also have evidence that people were starting to try to figure out that as well before the Uspensky Gospels. In Mount Sinai, we found, I don't say we, I wasn't there, but they found different bookhands in minuscule. What they found first was what they called the Sinaitic, because it was found in Sinai. I'm just going to give you a quick picture of it. It looks like that there. It's pretty nice. It's got some accent marks. It's upright. It's not entirely readable. And you can see how thick the letters are. They're a little bulky. But people are obviously trying to write something that's more formal. This is not a letter. This is a hymnal. So these are songs. And this is in the monastery there. This is dated to the 8th century. All right, so we're already 100 years before the Uspensky Gospels. They're doing this. So that's one example. Didn't take off. Why didn't it take off? Probably because it's hard to read. And there's no real indication that it ever left that area. Okay, we don't see it spreading really. Then they found what we call the Hagiopolitan minuscule. It looks like that. Now that's really neat. I like this. I like the way this is written. It's angled, but it's also very hard to read. And you don't really have many accent marks either. So you also have, it's a nice flourish, it's a nice look. But again, we're dealing with, could you read that if you put that in front of a lectern? If someone had to read this lecture, maybe, I'm sure they could, but could somebody else? So the theory is, and we don't know because there's nobody alive to have written about it to tell us, is that these two styles of bookhand writing didn't make it because they never reached past their boundaries of the monasteries they were in, and they weren't very legible for other people to read outside of the people that wrote them. So it's kind of hard to get that to take off if no one else can read it. All right? But these show us that there was a minuscule bookhand well before. We're talking at least as far back as the 7th century. So this idea that changed in the 9th is off by about 200 years. But then you get to the Pseudite minuscule. We call it the Pseudite because Nicholas was a Pseudite monk. They worked at the monastery of Studius, which is in Constantinople. And so that's where we come up with this name. This is the minuscule that won the day, as it were. Now, there are ways to identify it. You can see how nice, how formal it is. If you look down on the last line that you can read the full line, so we'll call it next to last line, about midway through you see a delta and an eta, the de there. Looks kind of like a bow tie kind of configuration. That's a very Pseudite way of writing that. Okay, they like to do that. They had specific ways of writing certain letters that stood out. Their lambdas are also fairly unique, and their use of C is, there's not one on that page, unfortunately, is also very identifiable. So there were certain ways that they wrote that were easy to point out. But you notice how clear that is and how straight, for the most part, that is. This is what eventually wins the day. So let's talk about how do you know it's a Pseudite text. There's more than one way to know. That we talked about writing. Now, can you see it? I think you can see it. Yeah, you can see it on the screen. We talked about, or we didn't talk about, Dr. Gurry talked about this last week, about lining. Remember how you could see the lines that they wrote? Well, scribes would border the manuscript with vertical lines and horizontal lines all around the edge. And by the way, this is where you get your notebook paper idea from. And then they would line across every single line, straight across with a straight edge, so they would write on a line. Everybody knows how much easier it is to write on the line. So that's not a Pseudite script, okay? This is a different person, this is a different monastery. That's how most people did it. One of the ways you can identify a Pseudite manuscript is they didn't. So you can kind of see on the far end of this one, the line on the border, right? What do you not see? If you look closely, there's no horizontal lines. They actually only did a border and one line through the middle of the text in most cases, which means they were able to write straight without a line. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried that, but that takes a lot of discipline to do, and you're doing it in this kind of script. That shows us that these men, and well, it wouldn't be women in this case, but these men were very disciplined in how they learned. And the one thing we know about Theodore is he was a very disciplined man and a very big disciplinarian. We'll talk about that in a second. So there's lots of other things we find out. They did things differently. So their manuscripts showed up differently. And they had the one that won the day. Now I'm going to talk about this real quick, and then we're going to move to the last section of this. These two pictures here show us the oldest known Pseudite manuscript. It's not dated, so we can only say that in air quotes. This is not the Uspensky Gospels. These, and I'm sorry, I apologize for the images, but these are the only images I know that you can get. They're photocopies that were in a book. Okay, I can't find access to them anywhere. These were found as inserts into another codex. We talked about that too, how certain leaves get pulled out of old books and they get put in other ones. These were found in two different codices or codices. One was in Russia and one was in Paris. But they're the same manuscript. They came from the same manuscript. Now, we knew it was Pseudite because of the way it's written, because the ruling matches up. They did the lines. They'd used the same type of parchment. They wrote on the same side that the Pseudites would normally write on to begin with. And you can see some of the similarities in the script. But in some cases, there's no accent. There's accents, but they're not everywhere. And if you look at more of the pages, I only give you these two pictures, but if you look at more of the pages, they're actually really sparse. Now, in the Uspensky Gospels, they're all on every page, but they're not on this one. And the man that researched in this, he put forth a theory, and I think it's fairly believable. He goes a little too far, but he puts forth at least a believable theory. We know that Theodore had a rule, and I'll read you his rules in a little bit, for calligraphers. And one of them was, I'll read it to you, unless the scribe elegantly holds the quire and places the book from which he is copying down and considers each of them, examining the book he's copying from and the book he's copying into, he examines both the lines, the text, the accents, and the markings, meaning the breathing marks. If he doesn't do that, he must perform 30 to 100 genuflections. So down on your knees, pray back up. So as punishment, if you didn't accent your book, if you didn't put breathing marks on it. So how did that one get away? Well, the idea is it must come before Theodore. If it comes before Theodore, it's over 100 years older than Uspensky Gospels. Interesting thing, it's not a biblical text, it's a medical text. Which, you know, if you live in a monastery, you kind of need to know how to fix people when they break something or, you know, they get sick, so it makes sense to have one. But we find that the Pseudite Minuscule, in a book form, existed at least 100 years earlier than anybody in New Testament studies has ever acknowledged. So that's one of the reasons we did this study. How old is it really? And I think the answer is it's quite old, but the book hand, the nice formal one, is goes back to at least the 8th century. I could even probably make an argument for late 7th century at this point with what we have. So, but what does it have to do really with this guy? I hope my head looks like that one day. I really do. Let's go back to him, because this guy in his monastery is in the corner of every discussion. He's never really out there in the front when it comes to paleography. Theology, he's all over the place. And when you read anything from this time in the icons, you'll hear about him. But he's always around. So what do we know about him? I already told you a little bit about what we know. But in the Life of Theodore, which is a book, in the Life of Theodore, written by Nicholas the Studite, the guy that wrote the Uspensky Gospels, he tells us that his uncle Plato taught him how to write. But he also tells us that his uncle Plato wrote in a weird way, in a way they had not seen. He called it sermiographane, which is it's a hapax legomena. It's a word you only find once or twice. I mean, it really doesn't exist outside of this use. It's actually the title of the thesis, I think, now. And if you cram the words together, it's two words. It's a compound word. It means writing fast with flourish. Now, it's unlikely that he's talking about majuscule, cursive, because that was all around and there was nothing special about that. It seems odd that he would be talking about minuscule, because minuscule existed, but did it exist in the way that they were writing it? And it doesn't seem to be. And so Plato, who lived, obviously before Theodore, but taught him into the end of his life, taught Theodore how to write a special way. Theodore then taught his monastery how to write in a special way, and they thought this was remarkable enough to point it out. Is he talking about their minuscule? I think he might be. And there are other people that think so too. There are people that argue against it, but there are people that think so. Now, what do we know about him? He ran a monastery that grew to the size that was bigger than Monte Cassino according to some scholars, which, if you don't know the Minuscule monastery, we're talking thousands of monks in this monastery. Was grown to that size under him. Now, he died, obviously, before it went to its heyday, but it was because he started bringing people in. He was favored by the emperors for his discipline and for his order. So favored that he was asked to educate other monasteries. And we have the rules of the Pseudite monastery still with us. And one of the things that they have in there, aside from they have rules for everything, right? But one of the things they have in there is rules concerning the calligrapher, which is a little bit odd. You don't see that very often in monasteries. And this is what his rules for the calligrapher were. If anyone in the action of making glue wastes it on account of leaving it out, 50 genuflections. Except the monk controls the quire and places it with the book from which he is copying. This is the one we looked at before. Looks in each place and examines both the lines of the text, the rows, and the accent marks. No less than 100 or 130 is what it's trying to say, genuflections. Now that's, think about that. Down on your knees, on your face, back up. 130 times if you don't put the accent marks in there. You should do that in Greek class, actually. That would be awesome. Have them write on the whiteboard.
Notice they had to do accents.
Yep. If anyone recites by heart out of the book from which he is copying, he will be separated from communion for 3 days. Yeah. Now, take that in an Orthodox context, okay? Not just, I'm not trying to belittle evangelical Protestantism, but remember, for the Orthodox, communion is the connection to grace, okay? This is the means of grace. So he's saying you don't get the means of grace for 3 days. That's a pretty serious offense, and that's just if you were trying to, think about it, if anyone recites it by heart, means if you're not paying attention, if you're not looking at your copy as you write, if you're trying to do it by memory, you're out of communion. So I often think I'd like to meet him. I don't know if I really would. He seems like a very, very
strict.
Yes.
That tells you guys this is a way mistakes happen.
Yep.
Right? You're copying something, but you already know what it's supposed to say.
And what do we see in the Gospels?
Not only are they aware that that happens, but Theodore is consciously making a rule for you not to do that.
Yeah. So they know it happens. And we see that so much in the Gospels with harmonizations and other things where they think they know what it should say and they end up with the wrong text. If anyone reads anything other than what is written in the book, this kind of goes along with the last one, from which he is copying, he will eat dry food. Now, it's a little harder to understand, but basically it's uncooked food. You don't get a dinner of cooked vegetables. You're going to eat it out of the garden, basically, is what that comes from. If out of anger he destroys his reed, 100 genuflections for breaking your pen. Now, I would imagine this is probably more about the anger issue than it is the pen, but still. If anyone takes another's quire without permission of the one writing it, 50 genuflections. Don't steal other people's books. It's a good rule. If he does not submit to the outlines or the instructions of the chief scribe, so now we have a scriptorium, right? He is to be separated from communion for 2 days. So what does that tell us? Well, Theodore, and you see this in the other rules, is very much about authority. You do what the man in charge of you tells you, and there are punishments if you don't. And that comes up at a later point I'll make. Lastly, if the chief scribe, this one goes to the guy in charge, if the chief scribe should divide the handiwork prejudicially to one, and if he does not carefully maintain the parchment and the bookbinding tools, with the result that this work might be effectively damaged, this is his penance, at least 50 and 100 genuflections, and rebuked, and separated from communion. Triple whammy. He gets the worst of it. Why? Because he's being particular with who he's giving work to. This is a violation of James, right? The book of James. He's also not taking care of his area of responsibility. So there are extreme punishments for calligraphers. You don't see that in most monasteries. Theodore had a very, very strong sense of how something should be written. And they give us an insight into the mind of these men, especially because most of the really bad punishments involve something to do with the chief scribe or not obeying the chief scribe. So, as I said, they were set aside for reading, but they were also set aside for writing. And these guys established a pattern of writing that was more disciplined than anything was ever seen prior to it. But what we find out when you start looking, now when you leave the manuscripts for a little bit, I know it's hard to say in this class, but when you walk away from the manuscripts and you start saying, okay, what happened in the world at the same time? This monastery grew to such a size, it grew to the biggest it ever was until the 13th century. Constantinople was destroyed in the 13th century, the monastery was burned down. Up until that point, we have the monastic documents of monks and monasteries all around them. And these monks were sent out to monasteries all over the place. They were sent to Mount Athos, a big producer of manuscripts. They were sent to the monastery of Caves in Kiev. What were they sent to do? They were sent to bring the rules of the studious to those monasteries. They were sent to crown rulers. They were sent to resolve disputes. They were sent to live. And when a monk goes to another monastery to set up an institution, they bring their books with them. So this is the proposition of my ultimate thesis, is these monasteries, and these are all locations that they ended up. Remember, they were, we're talking from Constantinople. They spread into the Ukraine, Italy, Greece, Russia. At one point, there's one in Russia, but I didn't put it on the map. They brought with them their type of writing. So how does one minuscule script win the day? One, it's from Constantinople, so it's with the emperor. So you've got the political power to do it. Two, you send the guys trained in the writing all around the known world. And as they start to spread, monasteries in these same locations start to produce minuscule script of their own that I think they owe to the studious monastery. And they don't just copy him. Keep that in mind. I'm not saying that they all write like Studites. They don't. But they didn't write like that prior to these guys showing up. I believe that as far as New Testament studies go, we owe most of our minuscule script to Theodore the Studite, to one guy. Now, this is all very, kind of paleographical and technical, and I don't want to leave it on that. I want to give you two closing thoughts, and this one, Dr. Gary will have it, because I want you guys to understand we have a benefit in Phoenix Seminary that we don't have to leave this as a technical mental exercise. So you're writing text critical work in a university, you don't get to add theological insight, right? That's not what they're looking for, they don't care. But in the seminary, we can talk about this fairly freely and how does this intersect with things. So let's talk text critical for just a minute. This is all very paleographical and historical. It doesn't really intersect with textual variants outside of some of the things we just mentioned with people not paying attention to what they're writing, all right? But we go back to a man named Klaus Fachtel who works in Germany. He is number one, well, he did work, I guess he's retired now. One of his number one life's work was talking about what's called the Byzantine text. You guys have heard that term at least once since you've been here, right? And tracing its history. One of the things Klaus Fachtel did was that he identified 3 stages of the Byzantine text type in manuscripts that he believed marked its evolution into what he would call maybe an empirical text that was no one deviated. You followed this text from here on out, right? We even have evidence of people changing their text to that text. And he marked that point at the 14th century. All right? He started his time on the Byzantine text when he really starts to talk about it. I mean, he makes suggestions about the 4th century, but he really says it really started in the 9th. The 9th century to the 11th century to the 14th century. The Studites mastered it in the 9th century. They spread their monks in the 10th and 11th century. By the 13th, they were gone. And by the 14th, the Byzantine text took over. Now, what I'm saying is that we have, in this history, a monastic order that teaches everybody to obey the abbot, obey the scribe, and do whatever they say. Spread that over several hundred years, and you have the perfect environment to create the Byzantine text that Klaus Fachtel is talking about in the 14th century, where everyone did exactly the same thing. Prior to that, and without that influence, something like the Byzantine text probably wouldn't happen. So how does this intersect with text criticism? If that's not clear, I can try to make it a little more clear if we have time for that. But how does this intersect with text criticism? It supports a theory of a textual critic. It's a historical key or hinge to everything he's saying. We literally have actions happening in the same centuries that he's described independently of how he sees the actual text type change. I think that's pretty fascinating. And I think it's an important detail. It's probably not one that's lost on him. I'm sure you already knew this. But it's important for me. It was important for me to try to write about it and share it. And then there's the devotional. And this is just, I don't share this with many people because, who's going to listen. But you will, because you have to. The devotional thing. This is something that happened during my thesis writing. Okay, this gets really, I'll be honest with you. When you're writing something like text criticism or paleography history, it can get really, really dull. It can get really dry. You're like, where's God in all this? I mean, I'm in seminary. It's intellectually stimulating, right? But am I really getting closer to the Lord? But as I reflected on what I'm looking at, I realized something. Every manuscript that we had, the majority of manuscripts that we have, we already discussed, are in minuscule, right? Not in majuscule, they're in minuscule. When the studium fell in the 13th century, it preceded what was called the Paleologion Renaissance. And what that was about 100 years later, new emperors took over, and it was a huge boom in manuscript production. Now, we're talking, science text, astronomy text, medical text, and biblical texts. The majuscule script would never have kept up. It would have died. The New Testament might not have been able to be produced as much as it was, were the majuscule still to be the way they did it. They couldn't be fast enough. So what do I see? When I try to reflect on a bigger picture, I see God using or orchestrating events seemingly completely unconnected throughout multiple places in hundreds of years, placing a man like Theodore in the right place, knowing who he is, to institute a change that was going to become absolutely necessary to preserve the Word of God in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. Your printed texts are in the original, and Stephanus, all those things, they're in minuscule. They'd made a text type based on minuscule. That's a change that I see God behind. So when I look at this, it's not just intellectual for me, right? It's devotional for me too. I can sit back and say, this is a God of providence. This is a God who is sovereign over everything, even something as simple as the type of writing that happened. And so I hope, you guys, when you do this, I hope this has been informative to you, but I hope when you guys take on your challenge for your writing paper, think about that sometimes. Think about when you're starting to feel down, like what is the point of all this in a spiritual way? Start thinking about, what does this tell you about God? Well, I think for me, it told me quite a bit. And I will take that with me for the rest of my time. So thank you. And if you guys have questions, let me know.
There are other ancient languages that also have the sort of cursive, continuous kind of script. And you talked about how Islam was moving across that. Could that have affected the style of writing also?
There has been some research into that. There's not a lot that can connect it because of when Islam took over. So you have Islam rising in about the 7th century. You already have Greek minuscule taking effect. Now, it is interesting that the Arab invasion removed all Christians from, eventually they removed all Christians from like administrative work. So the guys that were writing minuscule contracts and stuff had no jobs. A lot of them become monks. And so we find that there's I think a very good theory that that's how it kind of started bleeding into like the monasteries in Palestine and things like that, and in Sinai. But as far as the actual Arabic writing, no, I don't believe there's a direct connection. There may have been some influence because we have Arabic texts that are written in Arabic on the top and minuscule on the bottom. So there was definitely some translation going on. But the most direct influence was from the Latin, from what we can tell. Latin took on minuscule about 100 years before Greek. They started working on it in like the 4th, 5th century. And if you look at old Latin papyri, you can't tell the difference between a Greek and a Latin text unless you really know what you're looking at. I just recently showed it to a medievalist paleographer. She's on Twitter, so that's how we share things. And I showed her the Greek and the Latin papyri next to each other, and she was like, she'd never seen that before. She's like, she couldn't tell either. So and there's a whole chapter in the thesis. If you want to read that, it's in September 21st. It'll probably be on the shelf. But there's a whole chapter dedicated to that. So yeah, we believe it's because you have bilingual scribes working in the administration. They had to write something in Latin. They had to write something in Greek. They start to make them blend. And then that happens before we see Greek minuscule start. So it's a very good likelihood or strong likelihood that started to bleed into why they made some changes. And actually, some of the letters look very much the same. So, Evan?
The quote proposition of the thesis, what kind of literature is there to interact with?
Well, how's your German, Italian, and French? In English, there's actually some books here in the library that you can use that will help a lot. So Metzger and Ehrman give you some, but there's a small book by Pat Easterling that has a discussion about, it's called, I think it's just called Greek scripts in manuscripts or something like that. If you look it up by their author in the catalog, Easterling, and it's there. That's a really good, small, condensed kind of walkthrough of how Greek changed. There's also on archive.org, you can get one of the best English works by a man named Edward Mauden Thompson, which is just called Greek and Latin Paleography. He has lots of illustrations. He talks about a lot of the stuff that I talked about. It's fairly old, but it's still accurate in what it says. And there's another one. We have the book by William Hatch in the library, which is Greek Literary Bookhands, and the introduction. You don't even have to go any farther than it. It's mostly images. Okay, those books are mostly images. But the introduction gives you the entire history of the Greek script in about 30 pages. It's a really nice condensed one. So in English, that's available to you right now, those are probably the most accessible. There are some work by a guy named Nigel Wilson, who's a classicist that's done, but most of his stuff's very hard to get a hold of, because he's writing in big edited volumes, and you have to know kind of how to track that down. But any of those three, specifically here, you can get those. And I would recommend Thompson's because it's available online on archive.org. You can read that from home if you're really interested in looking into it. And like I said, it's good. It's very good.
We'll do one more question, then we need to take a break. Anybody else besides Eddie?
See, you were supposed to read the whole thing, and you said you were going to ask me all kinds of questions.
Jennifer, do you have a question? Or no?
No, he just teased me because he sent it to me and I told him I'd read it and I did.
She wanted to read it. I warned her.
We won't get into that. All right, Eddie, get the last question then.
Okay, have you done any research, we always talk about starting the earliest, have you done any research into the last places we find majuscule script? To see if maybe there's a cross-reference between the spread of Theodore's guys and maybe the last places where majuscule was being used?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, actually. And as he always shows up in any of our text critical discussions, a man named Georgy Parpolov has done a bit of work on that. And we do still see majuscule in lectionaries up until the 11th century. By the 12th century, it all but disappears. We actually have an example of Nicholas who writing in majuscule and minuscule in the same manuscript, which is interesting. But so we know they knew it. They knew how to write it, but they chose not to use it. And I think what we find is that as time goes on, it's relegated to titles. Now there is an interesting. There was some talk, and I can't remember who wrote this, but a historian once claimed, and I think it's probably true, that the majuscule took on almost an iconographic significance for the monks, because this was the hand the Bible was written in, right? And so that's why they would illustrate it kind of more brilliantly, and they would use that in the titles because this was the image of God on the paper. But yeah, it did not persevere though. So by the 12th century, it's pretty much gone.